The dust on the page matters here because one of the oldest mistranslations in your life may have been sitting under your fingertips the whole time. You were probably taught that Babel is a story about why people in different lands speak different languages. And that is much too small for what the text is doing. If you slow down and listen to the actual wording, the center of the story is not travel and it is not geography. It is coordination. Before anything falls apart, the people are described as having one language, one shared pattern, one workable unity. That is the force in the scene. Then comes the break. The Hebrew verb behind the turning point is balal. It means to mix, to jumble, to confuse. The text is making a wordplay inside its own language, turning proud babble into scrambled speech. So the old reading misses something important. This is not a children's lesson about accents. It is a study of what happens when order becomes interference. And you already know that feeling in your body. You sit at the table with a warm mug in your hand, ready to answer one email, make one decision, say one prayer, and somehow your attention is already torn into strips. One thought pulls toward tomorrow. Another drags up some old embarrassment. A third starts talking over both of them. You still have words. You still have ability. What you do not have in that moment is agreement. That is why this story has survived. It keeps landing because it describes a collapse you recognize without needing anyone to explain it. The building stops when the signals stop holding together. And once you see that, the old scene out on the plain starts to feel uncomfortably close, almost anatomical. In the next step, we have to ask a harder question. If Babel is really about mixed signals, where exactly does that mixing happen in you? If this kind of reading is worth following, stay with me and subscribe, because the answer begins with one very small Hebrew verb. That verb is the first clue, but it is not the only one sitting in the text. If you read the scene carefully, the strange line is the one people rush past. The danger is not described as height. It is described as successful unity. They are one, the passage says in effect, and this they begin to do. You can almost hear the scrape of brick, the dry wind over open ground, the sound of a project actually holding together. Then the mixing comes in, and work stops cold. The whole force of the story hangs on that break. Shared order produces action. Confusion interrupts it. And that pattern keeps showing up elsewhere in Scripture. A divided house falls apart. A wavering mind cannot hold its course. A single eye, a whole heart, one accord. Those are not decorative religious phrases. They are all pointing at the same condition. When attention is gathered, something in a person becomes capable. When it is split, energy leaks. You have felt that at the edge of ordinary life, in very small ways. Cold light from a screen on your face. The hum of the refrigerator in the next room. One task in front of you, and somehow you cannot keep the line. It frays. The story is naming that fraying. So when people hear Babel and imagine a lesson only about nations, they flatten the whole thing. The text is more exact than that. It is showing you a law of human function. One language builds, mixed signals stall. So the old scene keeps feeling uncomfortably modern. It describes what happens when agreement inside a system gives way to interference. Now, if that sounds too neat, good. You should push on it. A fair person ought to ask whether this is just a spiritual metaphor stretched too far. Because if the reading has any weight at all, your body should carry some trace of it. There should be a place where scattered streams are gathered into one usable field. And there is. It has a name, and it sits much deeper than speech. That deeper place is the thalamus, a small structure tucked near the center, and for this story, it matters more than most people realize. Think about what your mind is up against at any ordinary moment. The lamp throws light across the room. A floorboard clicks. Your sleeve brushes your wrist. There is pressure in your jaw, a memory trying to surface, a sound from the hall, the faint taste of coffee still on your tongue. All of that arrives as separate traffic. If those streams stayed separate, your experience would feel shredded. You would not live inside one scene. You would live inside fragments. The old story turns on the loss of a common field, and this is one of the places your body keeps that field from tearing. The thalamus has often been described as a relay, but that word is too thin if you leave it there. It helps sort, route, and bind. It is part of the gate that binds, the deep traffic point where scattered inputs are shaped into something your attention can actually inhabit. When that process is working well, the world feels single enough to act in. You can follow one sentence, reach for one cup, hold one thread of thought. That is already closer to the Babel pattern than it first sounds. A unified field is what lets many parts behave as one. Now, be careful here. I am not saying the whole meaning of the Tower of Babel, confusion of tongues, can be reduced to one lump of tissue. That would be sloppy, and you should reject sloppy claims. The point is narrower and stronger. If Scripture describes the cost of confusion as failed coordination, then a brain built for coordinated attention ought to have some central mechanism for holding scattered signals together. It does. And yet, a gate can only pass along what the wider system is doing. It can gather traffic, but it cannot force harmony by itself. For that, you need timing. You need populations of cells across huge distances, firing in sync long enough for perception and action to hold. Once that rhythm slips, the whole image of the tower changes again. Because the many tongues are no longer just poetic. They start to sound electrical. Once you bring timing into it, the old scene sharpens in a surprising way. Your brain does not work as a solid block. It is a vast population of cells spread across different regions, handling sight, memory, movement, sensation, expectation. For any demanding act to hold together, those populations have to line up well enough to share a pattern. People sometimes imagine thought as a private voice in the head, neat and singular. In practice, it is more like a crowded chamber that only becomes useful when enough of the room is moving together. Neural coherence is the plain term for that. When the system has it, you can read a paragraph, follow a face across a room, finish a sentence you meant to say. When it slips, the task may still begin, but it starts to wobble. That is where the image of many tongues stops being decorative. Desynchronized signals behave like competing speakers. One network is leaning toward the sound at the window. Another is holding a body sensation too high in the stack. Another is dragging forward some unfinished bit of memory. Another is preparing movement before the rest of the system is ready. Each signal has its own urgency. Each one wants the floor. The result is familiar. Your eyes are on the page, but the words do not land. Your hand reaches for the keys, then stops. You stand in the kitchen with the light buzzing above you and forget why you came in. The project has not vanished. Its coordination has. So when the text says the work ceased after the speech was mixed, that lands differently once you understand what complex action asks from a brain. It asks for enough shared rhythm that billions of cells can act as one language for a moment. Lose that, and the structure does not fall with drama. It just fails to continue. A fair skeptic could still say, all right, but this is only an elegant comparison. Maybe the story and the science merely resemble each other from a distance. That is a serious objection. Unless there is a way for you to feel the shift from interference toward order for yourself, in real time, without any machine at all. You can test that question without a scanner, and the test is strangely plain. Pick a simple task you care about just enough to notice when it slips. Read a page with the room quiet. Try to follow a short prayer from beginning to end. Hold one person's sentence in a conversation without drifting into your reply before they finish. What usually shows up is not silence, it is overlap. A sound from the hallway gets promoted. An itch on the cheek suddenly feels important. A memory leans in. A plan for later starts writing itself. Then a judgment arrives right on top of all that. Why can't I stay with one thing? In the language of the old story, the work has not been denied to you. It has been interrupted by mixed signals. That matters because people often turn this into a moral accusation too quickly. You call yourself scattered, weak, undisciplined. Sometimes those words hide more than they explain. The closer description is competition. Separate processes are pushing at once, and the shared rhythm needed for one clean line of action keeps getting broken. So the Tower of Babel, confusion of tongues, lands so hard once you bring it inside the skull. The many voices are not only poetic anymore, they are functional. They have consequences. A task can die from interference long before it dies from lack of talent. Now, I can hear the objection, and it is a fair one. Maybe this is just a clever overlay. Maybe we are draping an ancient image over modern brain talk because the fit feels satisfying. You should be cautious there. I am asking you to be. If the connection is real, it must do more than sound elegant. It should point towards something repeatable. It should suggest a way to move the system, however slightly, from fracture toward order. And that is exactly where this gets uncomfortable. Because the method is so small that most people dismiss it before they ever feel what it does. One object, one return, a few minutes. That is enough to expose whether the old text was describing something you can actually rebuild. That tiny method sounds too modest for a story this large, which is exactly why people skip past it. Here is the experiment. Sit somewhere ordinary, a chair with a rough seam under your palm. Air a little cool at the tip of your nose. Maybe the low hum of a fan in the corner. Pick one object for attention. Your breath is the easiest because it is already there. You do not need to improve it, count it, or make it holy. Just rest with one felt point of it for a short stretch. The rise in the chest. The touch of air at the nostrils. That is enough. What happens next is the part most people misread. They expect calm and get traffic. They expect a clean line and meet interruption. The leg wants to move. A grocery item appears. Then a memory. Then part of a conversation you wish had gone differently. Then the room itself grows louder, as if the floor, the heater, the small sounds in the walls had all leaned closer. This does not mean the practice failed. It means the mixing has become visible. The Tower of Babel, confusion of tongues, stops being an old image and starts behaving like a present tense condition. You are hearing the crowd inside the project. Stay with that carefully. Each time you notice that you have drifted, and each time you return to the chosen object, the system is being asked for a little more order. The thalamic relay still does its work, but now the wider pattern is being invited toward neural coherence. Less scramble, more shared timing. Nothing dramatic, at least not at first. The change is subtle, almost shy. A few breaths may line up. A sentence in the mind may lose its grip. A patch of attention may hold a little longer than it did a minute ago. And because that shift is so small, a skeptical mind will say, "Come on, that could mean anything." Fair enough. So the next question has to be sharper. If this return to one object is real, where exactly is the proof? In the feeling of peace, or in something much less flattering that shows up before peace ever does? The less flattering proof is usually the first honest one. When you try this for real, what rises first is not enlightenment. It is exposure. You start with the breath, or whatever single point you chose, and within moments, the mind shows you its crowd. A stale line from yesterday, a pulse in the foot, the need to adjust your shoulders, an old fear with a sharp edge to it. Then irritation at the whole exercise. That sequence is ugly enough that many people quit right there and say the practice made them worse. It did not make the confusion. It uncovered it. That matters for the old story, because mixed speech is only dramatic if you imagine the disorder arriving from outside. But in lived experience, the scattering often feels native, familiar. It has been running so long that coherence seems strange, and interruption feels normal. This is where the reading turns from clever to personal. Babel stops sitting safely in ancient time. It starts describing the default condition of an untrained attention. Many claims, many impulses, no settled center for long. And here is the harder observation. The moment you return to the chosen object, even briefly, something shifts. The room does not vanish. The body does not vanish. Thoughts do not vanish. But the system gets a clearer lead signal. For a breath or two, sometimes longer, more of it begins firing in sync around one task. So the repetition matters. Return is not a moral gold star. It is the mechanism. Each return favors order over competition. Each return gives the wider network another chance at neural coherence. If you have ever wondered why ancient spiritual traditions cared so much about recollection, watchfulness, singleness of heart, this is one reason. Those phrases may sound devotional on the surface, but they carry a very practical claim about human function. A gathered mind can sustain action. A scattered one leaks force. Still, another objection is waiting, and it deserves its turn. Even if attention can be trained this way, does that reduce scripture to brain maintenance? Or is there a reason the text linked unity with power in the first place? That question matters because once you bring the brain into a biblical story, people get nervous, for good reason. You may be thinking, all right, if unity has a neural side, then have we shrunk the whole thing down to circuitry? Have we taken a sacred text and turned it into maintenance advice for an overworked mind? I do not think that follows. In the old passage, unity is tied to capacity. The people can continue because they are held together. They stop because that breaks. Brain language does not cancel that claim. It gives you the bodily side of how such a break is felt. The page is speaking in symbols. Your nervous system is living in mechanisms. Those are different levels of the same experience. And this is where the practical side becomes more, not less, serious. When attention is shattered, your life gets shallow in very ordinary ways. You miss what someone said while they were standing right in front of you. You rush through prayer and never arrive in it. You open a book and your eyes skate over the print while your thoughts keep bargaining, replaying, wandering. The old image of confusion lands here with almost embarrassing accuracy. The project fails because the builder cannot keep one language long enough to build with it. So the practice of return is not just a calming trick. It is a way of recovering usable presence. A single object becomes a place where scattered claims lose some authority. The breath, the feel of your hands resting, a short line of prayer spoken softly inside. These give the system a center. The deep relay work we talked about has something cleaner to organize around. Gradually, there is less internal shoving, less interruption from every passing impulse. If that sounds too simple, remember how many important things depend on simplicity. Walking is simple. Listening is simple. Telling the truth is simple. None of those are easy when a person is split. And there is one final turn in this that makes the Babel reading feel less like an interpretation and more like recognition. Because the tower itself may not be what most people have imagined at all. That image changes once you stop picturing a monument on a flat plain and start thinking about a structure made of sustained attention. A tower, in this reading, is whatever can keep rising because a system remains coordinated long enough to continue. You feel that in small, almost humble moments. The sentence you finally finish, the apology you manage to say cleanly, the page you stay with until meaning settles, the prayer that does not dissolve after 3 words. These are not grand public works, but they are built the same way. They require continuity. They require enough inner agreement for one act to keep extending itself. That is why the old story links mixed speech with unfinished labor. Once the inner field fragments, height becomes impossible. Continuation is what gets lost. So the tower is not just ambition. It is vertical attention. It is the capacity to hold a line upward through time without being pulled apart by every competing impulse. You can hear how well that fits the rest of the passage. The people fear scattering. Then, scattering is exactly what arrives. In lived experience, that feels less like armies dispersing and more like your own intention breaking into pieces before it can take form. The coffee goes cold beside you. The room darkens a little at the window. Half an hour passes, and nothing stands where you meant to build. So the practice of returning to one object matters more than it first appears. Each return is a tiny architectural act. You are training duration. You are teaching the system to remain with one line rather than surrender to every cross-current. Over time, what felt impossible begins to look different. The task may still be difficult, but it no longer disintegrates as quickly. The same mind that once scattered in 10 directions begins, however briefly, to carry one beam at a time. And if that is true, then the final question is not whether the ancient story matches science in some clever way. The final question is much closer and much more demanding. When the Old Text speaks of one language and your own experience shows you how it returns, what exactly has been rebuilt in you? What gets rebuilt is not a fantasy of perfect silence. It is a workable center. That is the final turn in Babel. The story stops looking like a warning about ancient tribes and starts reading like an anatomy of collapse. Balal gave you the first clue: mixing, jumbling, signals crossing. The brain supplied the second. Complex action only holds when vast numbers of cells can keep a shared rhythm. The thalamus helps gather the traffic. Attention gives the system a lead to organize around. And from there, the old line about one language stops sounding decorative. You can feel what it points to. It is the state in which a human being can continue. So the tower is the standing shape of a gathered life. It is what exists when thought, sensation, and intention stop fighting for the floor long enough for one act to be completed. A page read cleanly, a promise kept, a prayer that reaches its own last word. The breakdown in the story is real because you know its texture already. The sudden inward scatter, the unfinished thing, the strange exhaustion of being pulled in pieces. What the text preserved was the pattern. What your own nervous system confirms is the cost. And the repair begins in a place so small, most people overlook it. A chair that stops creaking. The cool edge of air at the nostrils. A hand growing still on your knee. For a few breaths, the inner room stops behaving like a crowd at cross purposes. The work is not finished there, but a line is laid down. One beam holds, then another. By evening, the mug on the table has gone lukewarm, and yet something in you has remained long enough to notice. That is why this old story keeps returning. It is describing a ruin you can feel, and a form of rebuilding you can practice. If you want the next layer, come right back for the companion piece. And if this reading stayed with you, tap join below the video and stay close for the next one.